That, I can pull forward and hand this over to Tim to give us a service today. So it's all yours, Tim.
Thanks, Rob. Can you hear me okay? Just want to make sure
Mhm.
I'm coming through. Yeah, good. All right. So this is a talk in 6 parts. In it, I'm going to share excerpts from a few different books and essays with you. They've all shaped how I think about this year and what's happened in it. I've only pulled from the first few chapters of the books, so don't worry, there aren't any major spoilers here. So, prelude. Um, Last year, I was the English department faculty representative at an event for newly admitted students. These events take place in a large banquet hall where prospective college students and their families get a chance to talk with faculty members. My job was to stand under a sign that said English and answer questions about being an English major. I've done this several times, and I usually have one of 3 recurring conversations. One, a parent will drag their reluctant child over and encourage them to ask questions about campus or the types of courses we teach or student activity groups. Two, a student will drag their reluctant parent over. The student will ask about our courses while the parent will be distracted by the crowd forming around the business school faculty representative. And then 3, a parent will show up without a student and ask about our job placement rates or famous alumni or about things that I have published. Last year's event was memorable because something entirely different happened. As students entered the banquet hall filled with faculty members, a young woman beelined directly to me. I saw her moving in my direction, I saw her particular intensity, and I mentally queued up my list of noteworthy English courses on the schedule for next year. Hi, she said, I have a question. Why do you think it's important to read novels? I was completely caught off guard, and my knee-jerk response was the worst, most cliched professor answer possible. That's a great question. I know it is, she replied. So why should we read novels? I felt entirely on the spot. I don't want to go into the politics of the contemporary university English department, but my expertise is not in English literature. I study and teach about writing technologies, and I've never assigned a novel in one of my courses. I quickly thought about saying, well, that's a question for one of my colleagues who teach novels, but that seemed wrong. She had walked up to me with purpose. Besides, I read a lot of novels. I have thoughts about novels. If I couldn't reply to her with expertise, I thought I could at least reply with honesty. We should read novels because they help us imagine other lives, I said. They can help us understand other people, other places, other ways of living, and other possibilities. When I finish a good novel, I feel like I understand the world just a little bit more. She looked at me, smiled, said, yes, I agree. Then she turned and walked away. I didn't realize it then, but this happened in what I now call the before times. This year and the year after, I've often thought about her question. Part 1. In an essay titled Dystopias Now, science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson writes that dystopias are the flip side of utopias. Both of them express feelings about our shared future. Utopias express our social hopes, dystopias our social fears. There are a lot of dystopias around these days, and this makes sense because we have a lot of fears about the future. In January 2020, before the pandemic was a real thing affecting my life, when it was just a distant news story, I read my first dystopian novel of the year, Sarah Pinsker's novel, A Song for a New Day. It is a book I've thought about all year long. The book's protagonist, Rosemary, works remotely for a mega corporation named Super Wally. The story opens with a description of Rosemary's home workspace. The last poster was Rosemary's least favorite among the 6 mandatory inspirational posters adorning her workspace walls. The company sent new ones every 3 months, along with suggestions for their arrangement. Rosemary dutifully hung them, dutifully snapped photos of herself and her work environment to send along to headquarters. Her morning photo had even made the company website once under the caption, "Another happy Super Wally employee." She wasn't a happy employee, not a sad or disgruntled one either, just indifferent. Every morning she woke, ate breakfast with her parents, and went back to her bedroom where she transformed her childhood desk into a Super Wally vendor service center. Beyond the workstation, out of the company camera's view, were posters of the Iris Branches Band and Brain in a Jar and While Away. Even though she bought them from Super Wally with her employee discount, they still weren't part of an improved workplace environment. She used them to remind herself that she didn't belong to Super Wally. If she was valued but replaceable, so was her employer. In theory, anyway. She never had another job. While working on this talk and choosing which passages to share, I reread the paragraphs about Rosemary's home workspace and remembered a New York Times article from July about students who were starting corporate jobs from their childhood bedrooms. In Song for a New Day, we quickly learn that Rosemary was born in a post-pandemic America. Early in the book, she receives a new job offer, which requires her to leave home and travel through a post-pandemic world for the first time. Her parents are not excited about the prospect of this. The book describes this in a conversation between Rosemary and her father. He scratched his winter beard. I want you to be safe. And happy? And happy, but mostly safe. I'm old enough to take care of myself. You lived in a city 1,000 miles from your parents by the time you were my age. That was a different time. She knew the speech by heart. That was a different time, and this was a different country. The best thing we can do now is to take care of each other and stay in the safest place we can and make ourselves as self-sufficient as possible. Rosemary's new job is with a company called Stage Hollow Live, which produces virtual concerts because in Rosemary's post-pandemic world, people can't gather in person anymore. The book, I should add, was published in September of 2019, when such a concept seemed dystopic and not like a felt reality. Part 2. When most folks talk about pandemic novels, they talk about Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. One section of the book revolves around the Traveling Symphony, a Shakespeare troupe that brings plays to small pockets of people who manage to live through a world-ending pandemic. Mandel describes the pandemic and the broken world that followed. There was the flu that exploded like a neutron bomb over the surface of the earth and the shock of the collapse that followed. The first unspeakable years when everyone was traveling, before everyone caught on that there was no place that they could walk to where life continued as it had been before and settled wherever they could, clustered close together for safety in truck stops and former restaurants and old motels. The Traveling Symphony moved between the settlements of the changed world and had been doing so since 5 years after the collapse, when the conductor had gathered a few of her friends from the military orchestra, left the airbase where they'd been living, and set out into the unknown landscape. 20 years after the collapse, they were still in motion, traveling back and forth along the shores of Lake Huron in Michigan, west as far as Traverse City, east and north over the 49th parallel to Kincardine. They follow the St. Clair River south to the fishing towns of Marine City and Algonac and back again. This territory was for the most part tranquil now. They encountered other travelers only rarely, peddlers mostly, carting miscellanea between towns. The symphony performed music, classical, jazz, orchestral arrangements of pre-collapse pop songs, and Shakespeare. They performed more modern plays sometimes in the first few years, but what was startling, what no one would have anticipated, was that audiences seemed to prefer Shakespeare to their other theatrical offerings. People want what was best about the world, Dieter said. He himself found it difficult to live in the present. He played in a punk band in college and longed for the sound of an electric guitar. In March, just a few days after our schools had closed their campuses and converted to remote learning, Libby and I decided to travel to Pennsylvania for her grandfather's funeral. These were the early days when we didn't know much. We weren't yet wearing masks, and we brought all the hand sanitizer we could find. Today, only 7 months later, I remember more of the travel than I do of the funeral. How Libby and I kept talking about the emptiness of the interstate, how when we did see other cars, we wondered what emergencies those people might be running to, what catastrophes were causing them to travel. I remember the rest stops on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, closed to tourists and parking spaces blocked by rows of porta potties. I remember thinking about how quickly conveniences can disappear. In May, my uncle dies from lung cancer. The family holds a funeral in the backyard. Libby and I watch the service through Zoom. The audio is steady, so we hear each of the eulogies, but the video stutters and pauses, struggling with backyard bandwidth. It looks like a slideshow in a digital picture frame, a series of images of grief that accompany each speaker who is trying to maintain their composure while sharing jokes and remembrances and last words. Today, as I think about this, it feels like an apt metaphor for the moment. A year of gaps and absences, a quick bouts of catch up before the long pause and the next buffering. I wonder how people will have changed when I see them next, and how they'll be surprised by me, noting the new wrinkles in my brow and the deeper swaths of gray hair that weren't there when we last stood in the same room. How we'll try to return to the old routines, saying little of how we've been changed or how visible those changes might be. Part 3. Neil Stephenson's book Seven Eves begins its dystopia with the book's first paragraphs. The book begins like this. The moon blew up without warning and for no apparent reason. It was waxing only one day short of full. An amateur astronomer in Utah was the first person on Earth to realize that something unusual was happening. He pulled out his phone and blogged the event, moving his stiff thumbs, for he was high on a mountain and the air was cold as it was clear, as fast as he could to secure the claim to himself. Other astronomers would soon be pointing their telescopes at the same dust cloud, might be doing it already. But supposing he could move his thumbs fast enough, he would be the first to point it out. The fame would be his. If the meteorite left behind a visible crater, perhaps it would even bear his name. His name was forgotten. By the time he had gotten his phone out of his pocket, his crater no longer existed, nor did the moon. Seven Eves is a long, complex technical story that I love because it begins with a single event that is experienced through the eyes of one person and then felt worldwide. It traces out the panic and trauma and knot of social change that emerges from catastrophe. It tells a story that's slower than my lived experience of the 2020 pandemic, and yet it somehow feels more sudden. Environmental disasters, and especially climate change, have offered a deep well of inspiration for dystopian fiction. In 1962, J.G. Ballard wrote The Drowned World, in which scientists study an abandoned London that has turned into a boiling lagoon. Octavia Butler's 1993 Parable of the Sower takes place in a world where climate change has caused a cultural collapse, where water peddlers sell water to the poor and the people elect a president who promises to suspend minimum wage and employee protection laws and put people back to work. In Kelly Robson's Gods, Monsters, and the Lucky Peach, an eco-collapse pushed society underground until 2205, when, quote, they'd been determined to prove humanity could escape the hives and hells and live above ground again in humanity's ancestral habitat. Similarly, John Scalzi's The Collapsing Empire tells the sci-fi story of a network of planets called the Interdependency that are connected by a space-time travel conduit called the Flow. Early in the book, we see a scientist discovered that the flow, the universe's most precious resource, is collapsing, as two characters discuss. 10 years, Mars said, at the outside. He glanced over to his father. If Dad's models are perfectly accurate, less than that. Probably closer to 7 or 8 years before all the local flow streams are gone. Most of them will be gone before then. If we're lucky, he may still have time to prepare. Prepare for what? The collapsing empire, Jamie said, and the darkness that follows. In summer 2020, I read the third book of the Collapsing Empire series while the West Coast was burning. I remember an afternoon when, before taking my dog for a walk, I placed my palm flat against the sidewalk, worried that the ground was too hot for her paws and wondering what happens if it never cools. Part 4. In his book, Pre-Mediation, media scholar Richard Grusin describes how media shapes our feelings and expectations of something like a pandemic. He calls it pre-mediation. Grusin says that pre-mediation works to present citizens of the global media sphere from experiencing again the kind of systemic or traumatic shock produced by the events of 9/11 by perpetuating an almost constant low level of fear or anxiety. Premediation happens across all types of media for almost all events, but I think his theory is best explained through severe weather. Grusin writes that hurricanes are arguably the epitome of premediated televisual news events. The lengthy period leading up to landfall provides for numerous opportunities to premediate future catastrophic events: evacuation, flooding, wind damage, looting, death, property damage, and so forth. News coverage usually consists of a week or more of buildup as these named storms are tracked from their emergence as tropical depressions in the Atlantic to their development into tropical storms, and then finally their arrival as actual hurricanes headed towards landfall in the Gulf of Mexico or on the eastern seaboard of the United States. In the run-up to landfall, or sometimes the turn away to the open seas, global print, televisual, and networked media coverage focuses exclusively on the virtuality of these hurricanes, premediating possible future paths along with the death, damage, and destruction that might lie ahead. Grusin writes that extreme weather epitomized the ways in which news media continued to shift their focus from reporting on the present or recent past to premediating the future. Even when they do report on what is happening live, as in the run-up to Hurricane Ike's landfall, They do so within a pre-mediated format, in this case, that of extreme TV. Indeed, the arrival of hurricane season in the United States has become almost as regular and predictable as the arrival of football season. Maybe I should have told the young woman at the Make It Miami event that dystopian novels are a way that we inoculate ourselves. They prepare us for the worst. Or do they make things worse? I don't know. Maybe they're a warning we hand down across generations, from Brave New World to the Hunger Games, reminding us of when and how to panic. Part 5. In Children of Time, another science fiction take on Earth's end, a powerful egomaniacal scientist named Dr. Avrana Kern believes that she can save humanity by starting anew elsewhere. She escapes a dying Earth to reboot a new planet with human life. The narrator tells us that from Kern's perspective, human history was balanced on a knife edge. Millennia of ignorance, prejudice, superstition, and desperate striving had brought them at last to this, that humankind would beget new sentient life in its own image. Humanity would no longer be alone. Even in the unthinkably far future, when Earth itself had fallen in fire and dust, there would be a legacy spreading across the stars, an infinite and expanding variety of Earth-born life diverse enough to survive any reversal of fortune until the death of the whole universe, and perhaps even beyond that. Even if we die, we will live on in our children. In March of 2020, I think about Kern and the stories of colonizing space as I read articles imagining how billionaires might defeat the pandemic and how billionaires can leverage their massive wealth for good. In 2020, several of my friends start buying stocks through the Robinhood app. They buy shares of Tesla and watch their money multiply. In May, SpaceX sends humans into orbit. In her book, Infowhelm, Heather Hauser defines Infowhelm as a term that captures the abundance and ready availability of information, as well as its contestation. She says, I prefer Infowhelm to alternative because it evokes emotional inundation without specifying the content of the emotion. Hauser's term makes me think beyond a kind of information overload or paralysis. Instead, she's pointing me to a very felt emotional response we can have to an overwhelming amount of data. In a recent radio broadcast, Hauser says that I first took note of Infowhelm in the context of environmental crises like climate change. Daily life as a media consumer is now suffused with statistics on everything from carbon dioxide emissions to the health effects of air population on people of color. Currently, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, abundant, contested, and urgent data are more prevalent. She goes on to say, what does art have to do with this experience of Infowhelm? Studying environmental literature and visual art from the 21st century, I've discovered that artists don't just document the experience of data abundance. They turn it into a resource for bringing the arts and sciences together to produce knowledge. They instead overhaul perception, feeling, and thought, the crucial foundations for science, for social and environmental renewal. Part 6. Science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson has been critical of dystopian fiction. In Dystopias Now, he writes that, these days I tend to think of dystopias as being fashionable, perhaps lazy, maybe even complacent, because one pleasure of reading them is cozying into the feeling that however bad our present moment is, it's nowhere near as bad as the ones these poor characters are suffering through. Vicarious thrill of comfort as we witness, imagine, experience the heroic struggles of our afflicted protagonists, rinse and repeat. Is this catharsis? Possibly more like indulgence and creation of a sense of comparative safety. A kind of late capitalist, advanced nation schadenfreude about those unfortunate fictional citizens whose lives have been trashed by our own political inaction. If this is right, dystopia is part of our all-encompassing hopelessness. On the other hand, there's a real feeling being expressed in them, a real sense of fear. Some speak of a crisis of representation in the world today having to do with governments, that no one anywhere feels properly represented by their government, no matter which style of government it is. Dystopia is surely one expression of that feeling of detachment and helplessness. Since nothing seems to work now, why not blow things up and start over? This would imply that dystopia is some kind of call for revolutionary change. There may be something to that. At least the dystopia is saying, even if repetitiously and unimaginatively, and perhaps salaciously, something's wrong, things are bad. This is where I see a connection between premediation and dystopian stories, where disasters and disruptions are normalized and where our stories condition us to accept them. The week-long broadcasts that lead up to a hurricane don't ask us to think more deeply about climate change or encourage us to change policy or to think about the global consequences of something like climate migration. Instead, dystopic premediation turns climate change into sensational entertainment. Kim Stanley Robinson continues. Or maybe we should just give up entirely on optimism or pessimism. We have to do this work no matter how we feel about it. So by force of will or the sheer default of emergency, we make ourselves have utopian thoughts and ideas. This is the necessary next step following the dystopian moment, without which dystopia is stuck at a level of political quietism that can make it just another tool of control and of things as they are. The situation is bad. Yes, okay, enough of that. We know that already. Dystopia has done its job. It's old news now. Perhaps it's self-indulgence to stay stuck in that place anymore. Next thought, utopia. Realistic or not, and perhaps especially if not. Besides, it's realistic. Things could be better. The energy flows on this planet and humanity's current technological expertise are together such that it's physically possible for us to construct a worldwide civilization, meaning a political order that provides adequate food, water, shelter, clothing, education, and healthcare for all 8 billion humans, while also protecting the livelihood of all the remaining mammals, birds, reptiles, insects, plants, and other life forms that we share and co-create this biosphere with. Obviously, there are complications, but these are just complications. They are not physical limitations we can't overcome. So granting the complications and difficulties, the task at hand is to imagine ways forward to that better place. About 2 weeks ago, while thinking about how I wanted to end this talk, I saw the following tweet from novelist Robin Sloan. Quote, "Had a nice conversation with the bodega owner just now. We talked for a few minutes about running small businesses, trying to get loans, these weird times. There is such a thick substrate of practical, thoughtful, resilient people out there. I mean, it's basically everybody. Some afternoons, I find it truly shocking that a world of sensible people gets transformed through various dark and destructive channels into a public sphere and political landscape that is like almost unrecognizable. Today, I think if I saw that prospective student again with the questions about novels, I'd amend my answer. I'd add that novels can give us hope. They can offer warnings, sure, but in doing so, they also remind us that we don't have to accept the world as it is. There are still opportunities to accept our errors, to grow, to change, and to learn more about each other. In 2020, in this pandemic and whatever follows it, that seems especially important. I'd add that novels can give us hope. They can offer warnings, sure, but in doing so, they also remind us that we don't have to accept the world as it is, that there are still opportunities to accept our errors, to grow, to change, and to learn more about each other. In 2020, in this pandemic and whatever follows it, that seems especially important. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Harmony UU podcast. Check us out online at harmonyuu.org for more details. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Harmony UU. If you're in the Cincinnati area, please stop by one of our services on the first and third Sunday of each month at 10 a.m.